The forest blurred past me in streaks of shadow and moonlight, branches clawing at my arms as I ran. Behind me, I could hear them, not footsteps. Vampires didn't make sound when they hunted. I heard their silence. The unnatural absence of crickets and owls, the way the wind itself seemed to hold its breath as predators moved through the darkness. 3 of them, maybe 4. And somewhere ahead, pulling at my chest like a thread of fire that refused to break, I felt him. Ezequiel. The vampire who should have killed me 3 months ago. The vampire who had bitten me instead, tasted my blood, and discovered something that had shattered every law his kind held sacred. A bond, ancient, unbreakable, forbidden. The Coven called it an abomination. They said vampires couldn't love, couldn't form the soul-deep connections that humans romanticized in their fairy tales. But if that was true, why could I feel his heartbeat in my chest when he hadn't had a heartbeat in 400 years? Why did his voice echo in my mind, even now, desperate and afraid? Run faster, Leanne. They're almost on you. I'm trying, I thought back, and felt his agony ripple through our connection like lightning through water. If you've ever felt a connection so deep it defied everything you were told was possible, subscribe now. This story is for those who believe love can break any law, even the ones written in blood. My name is Leanne Carrasco, and 3 months ago I was nobody. A barista in a coffee shop that closed at 9. A woman with a small apartment, smaller dreams, and the kind of quiet life that never made it into stories worth telling. Then Ezequiel Shirley walked through my door 5 minutes before closing, looked at me with eyes the color of aged whiskey, and everything I thought I knew about the world cracked down the middle. He didn't order coffee. He ordered me to run. I didn't listen. I should have, but something in his voice, in the way his hands trembled as he gripped the counter, made me stay, made me ask questions I had no right to ask, made me offer him my wrist when I saw the hunger burning behind his careful composure. I didn't know what I was doing. Didn't understand that the blood of certain humans carried something vampires couldn't resist, a resonance, a harmony that transformed a simple feeding into something far more permanent. 1 bite, that's all it took. 1 bite, and Ezequiel Shirley, 400-year-old vampire of the Borman Coven, was bound to me forever. 1 bite, and I became the most wanted human in the supernatural world. 1 bite, and now I was running through a forest at midnight with vampire assassins on my trail, praying I could reach Ezequiel before the Coven reached me. This is the story of how love destroyed everything, and how it saved us anyway. I burst through the tree line into the abandoned church where Ezequiel waited, my lungs burning with mortal limitation. He caught me before I could fall, his arms cold and impossibly strong, and for one perfect moment, the terror receded. The bond between us flared bright, recognition and relief flooding through a connection that shouldn't exist. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice carrying that ancient cadence that made every word sound like prophecy. I looked down at my arms, scratched raw from branches, small wounds, nothing serious. But Ezequiel's eyes had shifted from whiskey to molten gold, and I understood the danger even before he stepped back, jaw clenched, hands fisted at his sides. "It's fine," I breathed. "I'm fine. How long do we have?" "Minutes." He turned away, staring at the boarded windows as if he could see through them. With his senses, he probably could. "Jabari leads the hunting party. He won't stop until he brings your body back to Carlil." Carlil Borman, the Coven master, the ancient vampire who had ruled this territory for 6 centuries and considered our bond a personal insult to his authority. "What does he want?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Your death." Ezequiel's voice was flat, empty, or my exhale. "Then let me die." He spun to face me, and the look in his eyes stole my breath. Fury and anguish, and something so vast, so overwhelming, that I felt it crash through our bond like a tidal wave. "Don't," he snarled, and the church walls seemed to tremble with the force of his command. "Don't ever say that again." Ezekiel, if my death saves you. Nothing saves me without you. He crossed the distance between us in a blur of supernatural speed, cupping my face in hands that could shatter stone. Don't you understand yet? The bond isn't a curse I'm trying to break. It's the first thing in 400 years that made me feel alive. I stared up at him, this impossible creature who had existed since before my country was founded, and felt tears burning in my eyes. Vampires can't love, I whispered. That's what they told me. Carlyle himself said the bond was a malfunction, a mistake. Carlyle is a fool who has forgotten what it meant to be alive. Ezekiel's thumbs traced my cheekbones with devastating gentleness. And vampires can't love because we're taught not to, because love makes us vulnerable, controllable, dangerous to the power structures that have governed us for millennia. So what changed? His smile was sad and beautiful and terrifying all at once. I tasted your blood, Leanne, and I remembered what they made me forget centuries ago. He leaned closer, his forehead pressing against mine. That existence without love isn't immortality. It's just an endless death. The sound of footsteps outside the church shattered our moment. Real footsteps this time. Deliberate. Carlyle's hunters wanted us to know they had arrived. Ezekiel, surely. The voice belonged to Seamus Odom, the Coven's oldest enforcer. Surrender the human and return to face judgment. This is your final warning. Ezekiel's arms wrapped around me, pulling me behind him as he faced the door. Run, he murmured. There's a passage beneath the altar. It leads to the river. I'm not leaving you. You're not dying for me either. The church doors exploded inward. 3 vampires poured through the shattered doorway, moving with the fluid grace of predators who had hunted prey for centuries. Seamus Odom led them, his silver hair gleaming in the moonlight that streamed through broken windows. Behind him came Jabari Helm, all muscle and barely contained violence, and a female vampire I recognized from Ezekiel's descriptions. Lucia Blankenship, a member of the Coven Council. Her presence meant this wasn't just a hunt, it was a formal arrest. Brother, Seamus said, and the ancient title sounded like a curse on his lips. You disappoint us. The feeling is mutual. Ezekiel's voice carried no fear, only cold contempt. Since when does the Coven send 3 hunters for 1 human woman? Since that human woman corrupted one of our oldest bloodlines. Seamus's pale eyes found me over Ezekiel's shoulder, and I saw nothing there. No hatred, no anger, just the empty assessment of a predator calculating the effort required to kill. She didn't corrupt anything, Ezekiel snarled. The bond formed naturally, organically, as it was meant to form before we forgot our own history. The bond is forbidden, Lucia Blankenship interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. You know this, Ezekiel. You've known it for 4 centuries. I know what Carlyle has chosen to forbid. Ezekiel's hands clenched at his sides. That doesn't make it law. Carlyle's word is law. Jabari stepped forward, clearly eager for violence. And his word is clear. The human dies tonight, or you stand trial for treason against the Coven. Then I stand trial. The declaration echoed through the church like thunder. Even Seamus looked surprised, his composed features flickering with something that might have been respect. You would risk execution? Lucia asked. For a mortal who will die within decades regardless. I would burn the Coven to ash for her. Ezekiel's words hung in the air, and I felt the truth of them through our bond. He meant every syllable. He would destroy everything he had known for 400 years, everyone he had called family, for a woman he had met 3 months ago in a coffee shop. The weight of that love was staggering, humbling, terrifying in its absoluteness. Very well. Seamus's voice was ice. The Coven Council will convene in 3 nights to judge your case. Until then, You will both be taken into custody." "No." Every vampire in the room tensed at Ezequiel's refusal. "You don't have a choice," Jabari growled, moving forward. Ezequiel moved faster. One moment he stood before me like a shield. The next, Jabari was against the far wall, Ezequiel's hand around his throat, and Seamus and Lucia had frozen in place, not from fear, but from something far more powerful. The blood command. I had heard Ezequiel mention it once, in whispered tones that suggested forbidden knowledge. The ability of bonded vampires to command others of their kind through the ancient blood ties that connected all vampires to their original source. It wasn't supposed to be possible anymore. The modern vampires had evolved beyond such primitive connections. But Ezequiel wasn't a modern vampire. He was old, perhaps older than he had ever admitted. "I will attend the trial," he said, his voice resonating with power that made my bones ache. "I will answer for my choices before the council. But Leanne remains free until judgment is rendered. Touch her before then, and I will show you exactly what 4 centuries of restraint looks like when it breaks." He released Jabari, who crumpled to the ground gasping. Seamus stared at Ezequiel with new wariness in his ancient eyes. The council will not appreciate threats. Then the council should not make them. Ezequiel returned to my side, his hand finding mine. 3 nights. I'll be there. Now leave." They left, not willingly, not gracefully, but they left. And as the last vampire disappeared into the darkness, Ezequiel's composure finally cracked. He sagged against me, and I realized with horror that the display of power had cost him dearly. Ezequiel. "I'm all right." He wasn't. I could feel his exhaustion through our bond, the way his ancient body screamed for blood, for rest, for the sustenance he had been denying himself to keep me safe. "You need to feed," I said quietly. His jaw tightened. "No." "You just faced down 3 vampires. You used power you shouldn't have, and you haven't fed properly in weeks." "I can't feed from you." His voice broke on the words. "Every time I taste your blood, the bond grows stronger, deeper, more impossible to break." "Would that be so terrible?" He looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw eternity. 400 years of loneliness and hunger, and the desperate, terrible hope that he had finally found something worth existing for. "It would be forever, Leanne." "I know." "Do you?" He cupped my face again, searching my expression for doubt. "If the bond completes, if I feed from you again, there will be no going back. No normal life. No quiet death decades from now. You will be tied to me until one of us is destroyed." I thought about my small apartment, my quiet dreams, the life I had lived before he walked into my coffee shop and shattered my understanding of what was possible. Then I took his hand and pressed it against my chest, letting him feel my heartbeat, the one he claimed to feel even when we were miles apart. "Then let's stop running from forever," I said, "and start fighting for it." The safe house was a cottage at the edge of the territory, hidden by old magic that predated the Coven itself. Enessa Trevino had arranged it. Ezequiel's sister by blood, if not by birth, turned 3 centuries ago and loyal to him in ways that transcended Coven law. She had taken one look at me, at the bond pulsing visibly between Ezequiel and myself, and simply nodded. "The old ones remembered," she had said. "The blood bonds that shaped our kind before politics poisoned us." "Khalil fears what you represent, Ezequiel, not because it's wrong, because it's powerful." Now we were alone, and Ezequiel was dying. Not literally. Vampires didn't die from hunger. They simply became less. Their minds fogged, their control slipped, and eventually they descended into a feral state that required centuries of sleep to recover from. I could see it happening. The way his hands trembled, the way his eyes kept sliding toward my throat, then jerking away in shame. "Ezequiel." "Don't." He stood at the window, his back to me, every line of his body rigid with restraint. I can't. If I feed from you now in this state, I might not be able to stop. You won't hurt me. You don't know that. Yes, I do. I crossed to him, placed my hand on his shoulder, felt him shudder at the contact. The bond protects me. You explained that yourself. The deeper the connection, the more impossible it becomes for you to harm me. The bond also makes me want you with an intensity that frightens me. He turned, and his eyes were fully gold now, the predator barely leashed behind his careful composure. Do you understand what you're offering? It's not just blood. It's not just feeding. When bonded vampires drink from their partners, it's intimate, I finished. I know. More than intimate. His voice dropped to a ragged whisper. It's complete. I'll feel everything you feel. You'll feel everything I feel. Every emotion, every thought, every desire laid bare between us with nothing hidden. My heart hammered in my chest, and that scares you. It terrifies me. He laughed, hollow and broken. I've spent 4 centuries building walls, Leanne, hiding what I am, what I feel, what I want. In 3 months, you've dismantled every defense I ever constructed. I reached up and cupped his face the way he so often cupped mine, forcing him to meet my eyes. Then stop defending, I said, and let me in. The kiss that followed was not gentle. It was 400 years of loneliness crashing against 3 months of impossible love. His hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, and I felt the moment his control finally broke. His lips traced down my jaw, my neck, pausing at the pulse point that throbbed with every racing beat of my heart. Last chance, he breathed against my skin. Once I taste you again, the bond will complete. You'll be mine forever, Leanne, and I'll be yours. I know, I whispered. I'm counting on it. His fangs pierced my throat. Pain flared bright and sharp, then transformed into something else entirely. Pleasure cascaded through my veins, electric and overwhelming, and I felt the bond between us explode into full brilliance. Suddenly, I was inside his mind. 4 centuries of memory crashed over me. His human life, brief and bright, ended by plague. His turning, violent and terrifying, at the hands of a vampire he later destroyed. The endless years of feeding and fighting and forcing himself to feel nothing because feeling meant vulnerability. And then, cutting through all that darkness like a blade of sunlight, me, walking into that coffee shop, offering my wrist without understanding what I was giving, tasting of something he had forgotten existed. Hope. I felt his wonder at my courage. His terror at how much he needed me. His absolute, unshakable certainty that he would burn the world to keep me safe. And through the bond, now complete and blazing between us, he felt everything I felt too. My fear of death, my greater fear of losing him. My love, young but fierce, that had grown from a strange encounter into something I would kill or die for without hesitation. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were no longer gold. They were amber again, warm and bright, and filled with tears he hadn't shed in centuries. Leanne, he breathed. I know. I smiled up at him, dizzy from blood loss and the overwhelming weight of our merged emotions. I felt it too. He gathered me in his arms, carrying me to the cottage's small bed, and laid me down with more tenderness than I had ever experienced. Rest now, he murmured, pressing a kiss to my forehead. The trial comes in 3 nights, and when it does, the Coven will learn what happens when they threaten something I love. I closed my eyes, Ezequiel's presence wrapped around me through the bond like armor, and let myself believe that we might actually survive this. The Coven wanted me dead. Carlil Borman himself had ordered my execution, and somewhere out there, Seamus Odom was planning how to destroy the bond that now blazed between me and the vampire who had chosen me over everything he had known for 400 years. But as I drifted into sleep, Ezequiel's cold hand intertwined with mine, I felt something I had never felt before in my quiet, small life. Inevitable. like the bond between us had been written in blood before either of us was born. Like the love that consumed us both was older than the Coven, older than vampires themselves. Like we were always meant to find each other. And nothing, not Coven law, not ancient tradition, not death itself, would tear us apart. If you feel the bond forming between Ezequiel and Leanne, if you believe love this powerful deserves to survive what's coming, subscribe now. The Coven trial approaches, and everything hangs in the balance. The Hall of Crimson Judgment had stood for 800 years beneath the city, carved from living rock and lit by flames that never died. I had imagined vampire courts as Gothic cathedrals filled with cobwebs and shadows. The reality was far more terrifying. Polished obsidian floors reflected torchlight like black mirrors. Ancient tapestries depicted scenes of vampire history that made my stomach turn. And seated on 7 thrones of carved bone, the Coven Council watched our approach with eyes that had witnessed empires rise and fall. Khalil Borman occupied the central throne. He was beautiful in the way that avalanches are beautiful, devastating, unstoppable. His skin was dark as midnight, his features carved with the precision of a master sculptor, and his eyes held the weight of 6 centuries of absolute power. When those eyes found me, I felt the temperature drop 10 degrees. Ezequiel, surely. Khalil's voice filled the chamber without effort, resonating off stone walls that had absorbed centuries of judgment. You stand accused of forming a forbidden blood bond with a mortal human. How do you answer? Ezequiel stood beside me, his hand clasping mine despite the scandalized murmurs from the vampires filling the gallery behind us. Hundreds of them, all watching, all waiting to see what happened when love challenged law. I answer that the accusation is true, Ezequiel said, his voice equally strong, and that the law forbidding blood bonds is a corruption of our original nature, instituted by frightened elders who valued control over connection. The murmurs became gasps. Lucia Blankenship leaned forward from her throne on Khalil's right. You dare challenge 8 centuries of Coven law. I dare speak truth that you've all chosen to forget. Ezequiel released my hand and stepped forward, addressing not just the council, but every vampire in the chamber. The first vampires bonded freely. Our kind was created with the capacity for soul-deep connection, because that connection made us stronger, not weaker. The first vampires nearly destroyed themselves with those bonds. Julio Wicker interrupted from his throne. His face was gaunt, his eyes cruel, and his hatred for me radiated across the distance between us. When bonded partners died, their surviving mates descended into madness. The forbidden law exists to protect our kind from extinction. The law exists because bonded vampires couldn't be controlled. Enissa Trevino's voice rang out from the gallery, and I turned to see her standing among the observers, defiant despite the guards moving toward her. Bonded pairs answered only to each other. They couldn't be commanded by Coven masters, couldn't be used as weapons or pawns. Silence! Khalil's command crashed through the chamber like thunder. The accused may speak. Spectators will remain silent or face consequences. But I had seen something shift in the watching crowd. Not everyone looked at Enissa with disapproval. Some looked curious. Others looked hungry, not for blood, but for truth. The human will now address the council. Khalil's words pulled my attention back to the thrones. 7 ancient vampires stared down at me, and I felt the full weight of my mortality pressing against my chest. But through the bond, I felt Ezequiel's strength flowing into me, his certainty, his love. I stepped forward. My name is Leanne Carrasco. 3 months ago, I didn't know vampires existed. I was a barista. I was nobody. I let the words hang in the air before continuing. Then I met Ezequiel, and I learned that the world was bigger and darker and more beautiful than I had ever imagined. He could have killed me that night, could have fed and erased my memory, and walked away like I meant nothing. My voice strengthened. Instead, he saw something in my blood that he hadn't felt in 400 years. Connection, hope, the possibility that immortality might mean something more than endless existence. Pretty words, Julio sneered. But you're asking us to overturn sacred law for a mortal who will die within decades. I'm asking you to remember who you were before you became this. I gestured at the cold stone chamber, the bone thrones, the calculating eyes that had forgotten what it meant to feel. You were human once, all of you. You loved once. Is eternal life really worth living if you've forbidden yourselves from ever loving again? Silence, then Carlyle laughed. A cold, ancient sound that made my blood freeze. The mortal lectures us on love, he said. How touching, how naive. He rose from his throne, descending the steps with predatory grace. Let me tell you something about love, little human. He stopped before me, towering, terrible. Love is weakness. Love is the chain that binds. Love is the blade that your enemies will use to cut you down. His eyes bored into mine, and you have just handed Ezequiel's enemies the perfect weapon. That's not. The bond between you is visible to any vampire with sight. Carlyle circled me slowly, and I felt Ezequiel tense behind me, barely restraining himself. Every rival, every enemy, everyone who has ever wanted to destroy Ezequiel now knows exactly how to do it. Kill you, and he falls. Torture you, and he breaks. You haven't given him strength, girl. You've given him the most devastating vulnerability a vampire can possess. The words landed like physical blows, because he was right. I had thought our bond was a gift, a miracle. But to these predators who had survived centuries through ruthlessness and control, it was a target painted on both our backs. The council will now vote, Carlyle announced, returning to his throne. The question before us is simple. Ezequiel Shirley has formed a forbidden blood bond with a mortal human. The law demands one of two sentences. Death for the human and imprisonment for the vampire, or exile for both, stripped of Coven protection, vulnerable to any who wish them harm. He smiled, and it was the cruelest expression I had ever seen. Cast your votes. One by one, the council voted. Julio Wicker, death and imprisonment. Lucia Blankenship, exile. Seamus Odom, speaking from his position as enforcer rather than council member, recommended death. Oscar Smalls, a vampire I hadn't noticed until he spoke, voted for exile with visible reluctance. The count stood at 2 for death, 2 for exile, with 3 votes remaining. Carlyle would vote last, as was tradition, but the next 2 votes would determine whether he even needed to weigh in. A female vampire rose from the 4th throne. Her hair was white as snow, her features delicate, and her eyes held something the others lacked: sadness. I am Danica Bear, she said softly. I have served on this council for 200 years, and in that time I have voted to condemn 17 forbidden bonds. She stepped down from her throne, approaching us with careful deliberation. I voted to condemn them because the law demanded it, because I believed, as Carlyle believes, that love was a weakness our kind could not afford. Her eyes found Ezequiel. But I have watched you these past 3 months, Ezequiel Shirley. Watched you risk everything for this human girl. And I have asked myself a question I should have asked 17 condemnations ago. She turned to face the crowd. What have we become? The chamber stirred with uneasy energy. We live forever, Danica continued. We possess power beyond human comprehension. We have wealth, strength, influence that spans continents. And yet we are terrified. Terrified of the one thing that made our existence meaningful before we decided to outlaw it. Danica, Carlyle's voice carried warning. Choose your next words carefully. I have chosen them. She met his gaze without flinching. I vote for acquittal. The chamber exploded. Vampires shouted, some in outrage, others in stunned approval. The guards tensed as if expecting violence, and on his throne, Carlyle Borman's composure cracked for the first time. "Acquittal is not an option," he snarled. "The law clearly states." "The law states that forbidden bonds must be judged by the full council," Danica interrupted. "It does not specify that judgment must result in punishment. Acquittal is rare but precedented. I invoke the case of Miriam Darkholme, 1832. Silence fell as the council members exchanged shocked glances. Through our bond, I felt Ezequiel's confusion and growing hope. "What is she talking about?" I pushed the thought toward him. "I don't know," he responded. "But Carlyle looks afraid. That's never happened before." "The Darkholme case was sealed," Carlyle said tightly. "Struck from records by order of the council of that era." "Sealed," Danica agreed. "Not destroyed. I found the documents 2 decades ago and have waited for the right moment to invoke them." She turned to address the watching crowd. "Miriam Darkholme formed a blood bond with a human merchant in 1832. The council of that era voted to condemn her. But before sentence could be carried out, her bonded mate was killed by a rival vampire seeking to use the bond against her." Danica's voice dropped. Miriam did not descend into madness as the old warnings predicted. Instead, she became something else entirely, something the council feared more than any feral vampire. She became focused, driven, unstoppable. She looked directly at Carlyle. She destroyed the vampire who killed her mate. Then she destroyed his entire bloodline. Then she came for the council that had condemned her love in the first place. The chamber was absolutely silent. 4 of 7 council members died before she was finally subdued. The survivors sealed the records and instituted the modern forbidden bond laws, not because blood bonds made vampires weak, but because they made bonded vampires too powerful to control. Danica's smile was sharp as a blade. The acquittal option was added quietly, a failsafe in case the council ever faced a bonded vampire powerful enough to become a threat. Rather than risk creating another Miriam Darkholme, they could simply let the bonded pair go and avoid catastrophe. She gestured toward Ezequiel. "This vampire just used blood command on 3 of our enforcers, a power that supposedly died out centuries ago. His bond with this human has awakened abilities that haven't been seen since the ancient bloodlines." She paused meaningfully. "Do you really want to risk making an enemy of him by killing the woman he would burn the world for?" I felt the shift in the chamber, the careful recalculation happening behind ancient eyes. Carlyle was no longer looking at me like I was an inconvenience to be eliminated. He was looking at me like I was a bomb about to detonate. "The vote continues," he said, his voice unnaturally controlled. "Danica has voted acquittal. Jameson." The 6th council member, a vampire who had remained silent until now, rose slowly. He was ancient even by vampire standards, his face a map of lines that suggested he had lived long enough to remember when humans still worshipped gods of blood and sacrifice. "I vote," Jameson Clemens said, each word measured, "for exile, with conditions." Carlyle's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "Ezequiel and his bonded may leave Coven territory. They may not return. They may not contact Coven members or interfere in Coven affairs. In exchange, they receive safe passage and a blood oath of non-interference from all Coven members for a period of 1 century. "That's barely punishment at all," Julio protested. "It's removal of a threat without creation of an enemy," Jameson countered. "Wisdom suggests we avoid antagonizing a vampire who can blood command our enforcers." The vote now stood at 2 for death, 2 for exile, 1 for acquittal, 1 for conditional exile. All eyes turned to Carlyle. He sat motionless on his throne for a long moment, 6 centuries of power and control warring with the practical reality of what Ezequiel had demonstrated. Then he smiled, and ice flooded my veins. I vote for Excel, he said softly, but I add my own condition. Leanne, Ezequiel's voice in my mind was sharp with warning. Something's wrong. The human must remain human, Carlyle continued. She may not be turned, may not be given immortality. The bond will last only as long as her mortal lifespan, and when she dies, as all humans must, Ezequiel will return to the Coven to face judgment for his actions. He leaned forward, satisfaction gleaming in his ancient eyes. Do you accept these terms? The trap was elegant, beautiful, even. If Ezequiel accepted, he would have decades with me, but only decades. And when I inevitably died of age or accident or illness, he would return to a Coven that hated him, stripped of his bond, vulnerable to 6 centuries of accumulated enemies. If he refused, the vote would deadlock, and by Coven law, deadlocks were decided by combat. Combat against the Coven master himself. Don't, I thought desperately, don't accept. There has to be another way. There isn't. His mental voice was calm, resolved, but he made a mistake, Leanne. He forgot the most important thing about blood bonds. What? I felt his love wash through our connection like sunrise. The human doesn't always stay human. I accept, Ezequiel said clearly. Carlyle's smile widened, but through the bond I felt something else. A plan. A desperate, dangerous, impossible plan that Ezequiel had been forming since the moment we walked into this chamber. He wasn't surrendering. He was buying time. We had 3 hours to leave Coven territory before Carlyle's safe passage expired. 3 hours to run, 3 hours to plan, 3 hours before we became fair game for every vampire who wanted to curry favor with the Coven master by delivering our heads. Enessa met us at the territory's edge, her expression grim. He'll send hunters the moment the grace period ends, she said, pressing a bag into Ezequiel's hands. Blood supplies, money, documentation that won't trace back to the Coven. It's not much, but it's what I could gather without drawing attention. You've done enough. Ezequiel embraced his sister, and I felt his sorrow through our bond. He might never see her again. You shouldn't have spoken up at the trial. Carlyle won't forget. Carlyle can choke on his own arrogance. Enessa pulled back, her eyes fierce. What he's forgotten, what they've all forgotten, is that the old ways weren't just about control. The blood bonds made us family in ways that transcended politics. We protected each other, loved each other, died for each other. She looked at me with something like respect. You've reminded them what they used to be, human. Whether they admit it or not, your bond with Ezequiel has awakened something that's been sleeping for centuries. The younger vampires are talking, questioning, asking why they've never been allowed to form true connections. Then Carlyle will crack down harder, Ezequiel said. Make examples, destroy anyone who supports us. Or he'll face rebellion. Enessa smiled grimly. Either way, things are changing. You've set something in motion that can't be stopped. We embraced one final time, and then Enessa disappeared into the shadows, returning to a Coven that might become her prison if Carlyle discovered the extent of her assistance. Ezequiel took my hand. We need to move, he said. There's a safe house 3 territories over, old allies who don't answer to Carlyle. We can regroup there, figure out our next steps. Our next steps include you turning me into a vampire, I said bluntly. That's your plan, isn't it? Turn me so Carlyle's conditions become meaningless. Ezequiel's silence was answer enough. You could have told me, I continued, as we moved through the forest at supernatural speed, my body cradled against his chest. Instead of accepting his terms like you were surrendering. I couldn't risk him reading my intentions. The older ones can sometimes sense deception. His arms tightened around me, and I didn't want to tell you until we were clear of his territory. The transformation. It's not simple, Leanne. It's not painless. And once done, it cannot be undone. You think I'd change my mind? I think you deserve to make the choice without a death sentence hanging over your head. He stopped at a river crossing, setting me down gently. Carlyle gave us a curse disguised as mercy. Decades together, then my destruction. But if I turn you before those decades end, then I'm immortal. The bond persists forever, and Carlyle's trap closes on nothing. Yes, Ezekiel cupped my face in his hands, his eyes searching mine. But immortality comes with costs, Leanne. Eternal hunger. Watching everyone you've ever loved grow old and die. The weight of centuries pressing down until you forget what it meant to be human. I'll have you to remind me. You'll have forever to resent me if you regret the choice. I reached up and placed my hand over his unbeating heart. Ask me, I said. Ask me if I want to spend eternity with you, and I'll give you my answer. Through the bond, I felt his hope warring with his fear, his desperate love warring with his ancient guilt. 400 years of loneliness had taught him not to hope. 3 months with me had taught him that hope was all that made existence bearable. Leanne Carrasco, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Will you? The arrow took him through the chest. I screamed as Ezekiel staggered, looking down at the wooden shaft protruding from his body. Not through his heart. Vampires were careful about that, but close enough to cause devastating damage. Figures emerged from the trees. 5 vampires. Hunters who had been waiting outside Coven territory, ready to strike the moment we crossed the boundary. Seamus Odom led them. Did you really think Carlyle would let you escape? The enforcer's voice dripped with contempt. The safe passage was theatre, a show for the younger vampires who were starting to ask dangerous questions, but the sentence was always death. Ezekiel snarled, trying to rise, but the arrow had been treated with something. Silver, maybe, or one of the ancient poisons that weakened even the strongest vampires. Run, he gasped, blood streaming from his wound. Leanne, run. I'm not leaving you. You can't help me. You're human. They'll kill you in seconds. His eyes blazed with desperate love. Run, live, remember me. Seamus laughed. How touching. The monster thinks his pet can escape us. He gestured, and 2 of the hunters moved toward me with predatory anticipation. I should have been afraid. Should have run, as Ezekiel begged. Should have accepted that I was a fragile mortal facing creatures that could tear me apart without effort. Instead, I felt the bond between Ezekiel and myself pulse with power. His blood in my veins, my blood in his. The connection that Carlyle had dismissed as weakness blazing brighter than the full moon overhead. And I did something impossible. I pushed. Not with my hands, with my mind, with the bond itself. Every ounce of love and desperation and furious refusal to lose what I had only just found. The 2 vampires approaching me flew backward as if struck by an invisible force. They crashed into trees, ancient trunks splintering from the impact, and didn't get up. Seamus froze. What? The bond, Ezekiel breathed, wonder replacing pain in his voice. Leanne, the bond has awakened. You're channeling my power through our connection. I didn't understand what was happening, didn't know how I was doing it. But I felt the power surging through me, cold and ancient and terrible, and I understood with sudden clarity what Danica had meant about bonded vampires being too powerful to control. We weren't just connected, we were one. And one meant that his 4 centuries of accumulated strength flowed through me as easily as blood through veins. You want to kill us, I heard myself say, my voice carrying harmonics that shook the trees. Then come try. If you're holding your breath waiting to see what Leanne has become, if you believe love can transform us into something more than we ever imagined, subscribe now. The battle isn't over, and neither is their story. Seamus Odom had survived 6 centuries by knowing when to fight and when to flee. He chose to fight. The remaining 3 hunters flanked me in a coordinated assault, moving with the blur of supernatural speed that should have made them invisible to my human eyes. But I wasn't seeing with human eyes anymore. The bond had opened something inside me, a window into Ezequiel's perception that let me track their movements as clearly as if they were walking through molasses. I raised my hand. Power erupted from my palm in a wave of force that sent all 3 hunters tumbling backward. One crashed into the river, swept away by the current. Another slammed against a boulder with a crack that suggested broken bones. The third managed to roll with the impact, coming up in a crouch with fangs bared. Seamus hadn't moved. He stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Fear, fascination, some ancient calculation that weighed risk against reward. "Impossible," he murmured. "Humans cannot channel vampire power. The bond doesn't work that way." Maybe you forgot how the bond actually works. I moved to Ezequiel's side, keeping my eyes on Seamus while my hands found the arrow shaft protruding from my bonded mate's chest. Maybe you've been telling yourselves lies for so long that you've forgotten the truth. "Leanne," Ezequiel's voice was strained but steady. "You need to remove the arrow. The silver coating is preventing my healing." I gripped the shaft, feeling his agony through our connection like it was my own. "This is going to hurt." "I know, do it anyway." I pulled. Ezequiel's scream echoed through the forest, a sound of pure torment that made my soul ache. But the moment the arrow came free, I felt his ancient healing surge to life. The wound began closing, flesh knitting together with supernatural speed. Seamus took a step backward. "Carlyle will hear of this," he said, and for the first time his voice carried something other than contempt, something that sounded almost like respect. "He'll send more hunters, stronger ones. You cannot run forever." "We don't plan to run forever." Ezequiel rose slowly, his hand finding mine. Through the bond, I felt his strength returning, amplified by the connection we shared. "We plan to run until we're strong enough to stop running." "And then?" Ezequiel's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "Then we come back, and we finish what Miriam Darkholme started." Seamus's eyes widened. For a moment, I thought he would attack anyway, throw himself against our combined power in a final desperate attempt to complete his mission. Instead, he bowed his head. "The old ones remember," he said quietly. "Some of us anyway. The bonds weren't just about love. They were about power, about creating pairs so strong that nothing could stand against them." He looked up, meeting Ezequiel's eyes. "Carlyle fears you because you've remembered what we were meant to be. The younger vampires will follow your example. Others will form bonds, awaken powers that have been dormant for centuries." He paused. "The Coven as we know it will not survive." "Maybe it shouldn't," I said. Seamus's ancient gaze found mine, and I saw something unexpected there. Approval. "Perhaps not," he agreed. "But that is a battle for another night. I will tell Carlyle you escaped, that my hunters were insufficient. He'll punish you for failure. He'll punish me less than he would for admitting what you've become." Seamus gathered his surviving hunters with a gesture. "Go, run, grow stronger. And when you return to tear down everything Carlyle has built, remember that not all of us wanted to forget what we were." He vanished into the shadows, taking his hunters with him. Ezequiel and I stood alone in the moonlit clearing, the river rushing past, the night sounds slowly returning as the supernatural predators departed. Did that just happen? I asked, my voice shaking as the power drained from my body, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Did Seamus Odom just let us go? He did. Ezequiel caught me as my knees buckled, lifting me into his arms with effortless strength. And more importantly, he told us something we needed to know. What? That we're not alone. His eyes gleamed in the darkness. There are others who remember the old ways. Others who are tired of Carlyle's rule, his fear, his strangling control. If we can find them, unite them. We can change everything. Yes, he pressed his forehead against mine. But first, we need to survive the next few nights. Seamus bought us time, but Carlyle won't stop sending hunters, and each one will be stronger than the last. Then we keep running. For now. His arms tightened around me. But Leanne, what you did tonight, channeling my power through the bond, that's not something that should be possible. The ancient texts describe it as a myth, a legend of bonded pairs so perfectly matched that they became one entity in two bodies. And we're one of those pairs. His smile was soft and wondering. It appears we are, the rarest of bonds, the most powerful of connections. He began walking, carrying me toward wherever our next sanctuary lay. Carlyle was right to fear us. He just didn't understand why. I closed my eyes, letting his strength surround me, feeling the bond pulse between us like a shared heartbeat. How long do we have before the next hunters find us? Hours, maybe a day if we're fortunate. Then we should keep moving. We should. He didn't stop walking. But there's something we need to discuss first. Something I should have asked before Seamus interrupted us. The memory of his words, cut off by the arrow's impact, surfaced through my exhausted mind. Will you? Ask me now, I said. He stopped walking. The forest around us was silent. The moon hung full and heavy overhead, and the vampire who had chosen me over everything looked down at me with 400 years of hope and fear in his ancient eyes. Leanne Carrasco, he said, his voice carrying the weight of eternity. Will you let me turn you? Will you accept immortality at my side? Will you become what I am, forever bound, forever together, forever mine as I am forever yours? I reached up and touched his face. This impossible creature who had shattered every law his kind, held sacred because he loved me too much to let me go. Yes, I whispered. 1,000 times yes. Ennis's allies had carved their sanctuary into the mountains themselves. The entrance was hidden behind a waterfall, the caves beyond lit by phosphorescent moss that gave everything an ethereal blue-green glow. A dozen vampires occupied the space, and they watched our arrival with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Ezequiel Shirley. A female vampire stepped forward, her dark hair streaked with silver, her bearing regal despite the primitive surroundings. I never thought I'd see you flee Coven territory like a hunted animal. Nathan, Ezequiel inclined his head in greeting. I never thought I'd need sanctuary from the family I served for 4 centuries. Times change. Nathan Tyler's eyes found me, assessed me, catalogued me as threat or asset. This is the human. The one who's caused Carlyle to lose his ancient mind. Leanne Carrasco, my bonded mate. The vampires stirred at the formal acknowledgement. Several exchanged glances that suggested they had heard rumors but hadn't quite believed. Blood bonded, Nathan murmured. Genuinely blood bonded. I haven't felt a connection that strong since. She trailed off, something painful crossing her features. Since before the forbidden laws. You were bonded once, I asked, surprising myself with the question. Once. Nathan's voice carried centuries of grief. Before Carlyle decided that love made us weak. Before the purge that destroyed every bonded pair the Coven could find. There was a purge. 300 years ago. Ezequiel's hand tightened on mine. Carlyle claimed it was necessary. That the bonded vampires were becoming too powerful, too independent, too dangerous to Coven stability. He convinced the council to authorize systematic elimination. How many died? 47 pairs. Nathan's eyes were hollow. 94 vampires who had committed no crime except loving too deeply. My mate was among them. The weight of that number pressed against my chest. 94 immortal beings destroyed because their love threatened a power structure built on control and fear. I'm sorry, I whispered. Don't be sorry. Nathan's grief transformed into something harder. be the catalyst that burns Carlil's empire to ash. Enissa told us what happened at the trial, what Danica revealed, what you did to Seamus's hunters. She stepped closer, studying me with new intensity. You channeled vampire power through a human body. That hasn't happened in recorded history. I don't know how I did it. It doesn't matter how. It matters that you can. Nathan looked at Ezequiel. If she can channel your power now, as a human, imagine what she'll be capable of once she's turned. Imagine what both of you will become. That's why we're here. Ezequiel's voice was steady. The transformation needs to happen soon, before Carlil's hunters find us, before my enemies can use Leanne's mortality against us. Nathan nodded slowly. We have what you need. Blood supplies for the transition, a secure location for the 3 nights of change, and allies willing to guard you while you're vulnerable. 3 nights? I asked. The transformation isn't instant. Ezequiel turned to face me, his expression serious. Your human body must die, your vampire nature must awaken, and your consciousness must navigate the space between life and undeath without losing itself to madness. That sounds terrifying, agonizing, potentially fatal. He cupped my face in his hands. I won't lie to you, Leanne. The turning fails sometimes. Humans who lack the strength of will, the clarity of purpose, the anchor of love, they don't survive the transition. But I have an anchor. I pressed my hand against his chest, against the heart that had stopped beating 4 centuries ago. I have you. You have me. His forehead touched mine. And I have you. The bond will guide you through the darkness. I'll be there every moment, every breath, every heartbeat until it stops. And after it stops. His smile was tender and ancient and full of promise. After it stops, you'll wake up immortal, and we'll have forever to figure out what comes next. A commotion at the cave entrance shattered our moment. One of Nathan's scouts burst through the waterfall, her face pale with fear. They found us. Carlil sent a war party, 20 hunters, led by Julio Wicker himself. The cave erupted into motion. Vampires grabbed weapons, took positions, prepared for a battle they might not survive. How long? Nathan demanded. Minutes, maybe less. The scout was shaking. They have trackers. Somehow they followed our trail directly here. Ezequiel's eyes found mine, and I felt his desperation through the bond. The transformation takes 3 nights, he said quickly. We don't have 3 nights. Then we fight. I straightened, feeling for the power I had channeled against Seamus's hunters. It was there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to be called. Together. You can't channel my power indefinitely. It will burn you out. His hands gripped my shoulders. There's another option, faster, more dangerous, but it might be our only chance. What option? A blood surge. I flood your system with so much of my blood that the transformation begins immediately, violently, without the gradual 3-night process. His voice cracked. It's how warriors were turned in the ancient times, before battle, before desperate last stands, and the survival rate. His silence was answer enough. Tell me. 1 in 3. I thought about the 20 hunters approaching, about Julio Wicker, who had voted for my death without hesitation, about Carlil Borman, who would never stop hunting us as long as I remained human and vulnerable. Then I thought about Ezequiel, about the bond that had shown me what love truly meant, about the forever we had promised each other in a moonlit forest just hours ago. Do it, I said. Leanne. Do it now, before they get here, before I have time to be afraid. He stared at me for a long moment. Through the bond, I felt his terror and his pride and his overwhelming, devastating love. Then he struck. His fangs sank into my throat, deeper than they ever had before. I felt him drinking, pulling my blood from my body in great rushing gulps. The world spun. My vision darkened at the edges. And then he pulled back, tore his own wrist open with his fangs and pressed the wound to my lips. "Drink," he commanded. "Drink and live. Drink and become. Drink and stay with me forever." I drank. His blood was fire and ice and lightning and earthquake. It flooded my system, burning through my veins, tearing apart my human cells and rebuilding them into something else entirely. I heard myself screaming, felt my heart stutter and stop, felt darkness rising up to swallow me whole. But through it all, I felt Ezequiel's presence, his love, his desperate hope that I would survive what he had just done to me. The last thing I heard before consciousness fled was his voice, raw with emotion. "Come back to me, Leanne. Come back to me." Death was not what I expected. There was no tunnel of light, no chorus of angels, no peaceful floating toward whatever afterlife awaited. Instead, there was fire. It burned through every cell of my body, reshaping, reconstructing, destroying what I was, and building something new from the ashes. I existed in a void of pure agony, unable to see or hear or feel anything except the relentless transformation consuming me from the inside out. But I was not alone. Through the darkness, I felt Ezequiel's presence like a lifeline. His consciousness wrapped around mine, shielding me from the worst of the pain, guiding me through the labyrinth of change. "I'm here," his voice echoed through the void. "I'm not leaving you." "It hurts," I responded, and even my mental voice sounded thin. "Fragile. Dying." "I know, but you're stronger than the pain, stronger than the change. You've always been stronger than anyone knew, including yourself." The fire intensified. I felt my human organs failing, shutting down, transforming into something that no longer needed breath or heartbeat to function. My bones ached as they densified. My muscles rewove themselves into configurations that could support supernatural speed and strength. And my mind expanded. Suddenly, I could hear everything. The battle raging outside our sanctuary, Nathan's vampires fighting desperately against Julio Wicker's hunters. The rush of the waterfall. The heartbeats of small animals hiding in the cave walls. The absence of heartbeats from the vampires. "That's it," Ezequiel encouraged. "Your senses are awakening. Focus on them. Let them anchor you to the world." I tried, grasped at the sounds and smells flooding my newly enhanced perception. But underneath it all, I felt something else growing, something dangerous. Hunger. It rose from somewhere deep inside me, a craving so intense that it eclipsed even the pain of transformation. I needed blood, needed it more than I had ever needed anything in my human life, needed it with an urgency that threatened to drown my consciousness in pure animal instinct. "Fight it," Ezequiel urged. "Don't let the hunger consume you. That's how the transformation fails. That's how new vampires lose themselves." "I can't. It's too strong." "Then use the bond. Use me." I felt him open himself completely, tearing down every wall he had ever built, exposing the core of his being to my desperate, hungry, barely conscious mind. And there it was. Love. Not the gentle, comfortable love of long marriages. Not the passionate, burning love of new romance. Something older, deeper. A love that had survived 4 centuries of loneliness and emerged strong enough to break every law his kind held sacred. Love that could anchor me through the storm of transformation. I grasped it like a drowning woman grasping a rope. Let it fill the places where hunger threatened to consume me. Let it remind me who I was, what I wanted, why I had chosen this path despite the risks. The fire began to fade. The hunger settled into something manageable. Still present, still demanding, but no longer the all-consuming madness that destroyed most newly turned vampires. "You're doing it," Ezequiel's voice was thick with relief. "Leanne, you're surviving. I told you I would. You told me many things. This is the first one I allowed myself to believe." Sensation returned in stages. First touch, the cold stone beneath my back, Ezequiel's hand clasped in mine. Then smell, blood and fire, and the mineral scent of the cave. Then sight blurry at first, then sharp enough to count the phosphorescent spores on the moss 50 feet away. I sat up slowly, testing my new body. Everything felt different, stronger, more alive, paradoxically, than I had ever felt while actually living. "How long?" I asked, and my voice carried harmonics I didn't recognize. 47 minutes. Ezequiel's face swam into focus, pale with exhaustion, dark with worry, beautiful with hope. The fastest transformation I've ever witnessed. The battle. Still raging. He helped me to my feet, and I marveled at how easily I stood. No weakness, no lingering pain, just power coiled and waiting. Nathan's people are holding, but barely. Julio brought veterans, ancient killers who have been hunting bonded pairs since the purge. Then let's end it. Ezequiel's eyes widened. You've been vampire for less than an hour. You need to feed to rest, to learn. I need to save the people who gave us sanctuary. I took a step toward the cave entrance, and my new body responded with supernatural grace. And I need to show Khalil Borman exactly what he created when he tried to destroy us. Through our bond, I felt Ezequiel's pride warring with his protective instincts, his desperate need to wrap me in safety warring with his recognition that I was no longer the fragile human he had carried through forests and hidden in safe houses. I was something else now, something powerful, something that Khalil Borman had every reason to fear. Together, I asked, extending my hand. Ezequiel took it. And through the bond, I felt our powers merge, amplify, become something greater than either of us alone. Together, he agreed, always and forever. We walked toward the sounds of battle, and the Coven's hunters learned what happened when love refused to die. The battle outside the waterfall had become a slaughter. Nathan's rebels fought with desperate courage, but Julio Wicker's hunters were ancient, ruthless, and trained for exactly this kind of assault. 3 of Nathan's vampires lay motionless on the rocky ground. 2 more were pinned against the cliff face, moments from destruction. Julio himself stood at the center of the carnage, directing his forces with cold precision. His gaunt face showed no emotion as he watched his hunters systematically eliminate the sanctuary's defenders. Then Ezequiel and I stepped through the waterfall. The battle paused. Every vampire present turned to stare at us, and I felt their shock ripple through the night air. They had expected a wounded Ezequiel protecting a fragile human. Instead, they saw 2 vampires standing side by side, our bond blazing between us like visible fire. Impossible, Julio breathed. The transformation takes 3 nights. She should be dead or dying. She should be many things, Ezequiel replied, his voice carrying across the battlefield with ancient authority. Instead, she is my mate, my equal, and your worst nightmare. Julio's shock transformed into fury. Kill them both, he screamed. Kill them now. His hunters surged forward, 8 of them moving in coordinated assault, centuries of combat experience driving them toward us with lethal intent. I raised my hand. The power that erupted from my palm was nothing like what I had channeled as a human. That had been borrowed strength, Ezequiel's abilities flowing through our bond. This was something entirely different. This was my own power, newborn and raw and terrible. The first wave of hunters flew backward as if struck by an invisible giant. 2 crashed into the waterfall with enough force to shatter the rock behind it. 3 more tumbled down the mountainside, their ancient bodies broken by the impact. The remaining hunters hesitated. "What are you?" One of them whispered, genuine terror replacing his predatory confidence. "I am what you tried to prevent," I said, and my voice carried harmonics that made the very stones vibrate. "I am what Khalil Borman feared so much that he outlawed love itself to stop it from happening." I stepped forward, and the hunters stepped back. I am a blood-bonded vampire, the first to be created in 300 years. And I am very, very angry about what your coven did to the 94 who came before me." Julio Wicker drew himself up, refusing to show fear despite the terror I could smell radiating from his ancient body. "You are an abomination," he spat. "A perversion of what vampires were meant to be. Carlil will never stop hunting you. The entire coven will rise against you. You cannot fight us all." "She won't have to." Nathan Tyler stepped forward, bloody but unbowed, her surviving rebels gathering behind her. "The outcasts remember the old ways," Nathan continued. "The rogues, the exiles, the vampires who were cast out for daring to question Carlil's rule. We've been waiting for something to believe in, someone to follow." She looked at me with ancient eyes that had seen too much grief and not enough hope. "We've been waiting for you." Other figures emerged from the shadows. Vampires I didn't recognize, drawn by the commotion, by the impossible power radiating from the newborn who had just defeated 8 veteran hunters without breaking a sweat. Seamus Odom stepped from the tree line, his hunters arrayed behind him. "I told you we weren't all loyal to Carlil's vision," he said quietly. "Some of us remember what we lost, what was taken from us." More vampires appeared. 12, 24, ancient and young, powerful and weak, all united by a single shared experience. Rejection, exile, the crushing weight of laws that forbade them from forming the connections that made immortality bearable. Julio looked around at the gathering crowd, and I watched his arrogance crumble into fear. "This is treason," he stammered. "This is rebellion against the Coven itself." "No," Ezequiel said, moving to stand beside me. "This is revolution, and it's been coming for 300 years." He turned to address the assembled vampires, his voice carrying the authority of 4 centuries. "Carlil Borman built his power on fear and isolation. He convinced us that love was weakness, that connection was vulnerability, that the bonds which once made our kind great were chains to be broken." Ezequiel's hand found mine, our fingers intertwining. He was wrong. He raised our joined hands, and I felt the bond between us flare bright enough to be visible, a ribbon of golden light connecting my heart to his. This is what we were meant to be, not solitary predators fighting over territory and power, not isolated immortals watching the centuries pass in lonely silence. We were meant to love, to bond, to build something greater than ourselves. The crowd stirred. I felt hope kindling in ancient hearts that had forgotten what hope felt like. "Carlil's coven is built on lies," Ezequiel continued. "But we can build something new, something true. A haven for vampires who are tired of existing without living, who want to remember what it meant to feel." "And what about the hunters?" Julio demanded, gesturing at his remaining forces. "What about the thousands of vampires who serve the Coven loyally? You cannot simply declare a new order and expect the old one to crumble." "I expect nothing," I said, stepping forward to address Julio directly. "But I offer something Carlil never could." "And what is that?" "A choice." I let my power flow outward, not as a weapon, but as a demonstration. The vampires gathered around us felt it wash over them, warm and welcoming and impossibly alive. "Go back to Carlil," I told Julio. "Tell him what you've seen tonight. Tell him that the silver blood lineage isn't the only power that awakens through love. Tell him that the bonded pairs he tried to exterminate have a successor. And tell him that I'm offering sanctuary to any vampire brave enough to choose connection over control." Julio's face contorted with conflicting emotions, duty to his coven, fear of what I had become, and underneath it all, barely visible, something that might have been longing. "You're asking me to deliver an ultimatum to the most powerful vampire in 7 territories," he said. "I'm asking you to deliver the truth." I met his eyes without flinching. "What Carlil does with it is his choice. What you do with it is yours." For a long moment, Julio stood motionless. Then slowly he bowed his head. "I will deliver your message," he said quietly. But know this, newborn. Carlil will not simply accept your rebellion. He will come for you with everything he has. Every hunter, every ally, every resource at his disposal. I'm counting on it. Julio gathered his surviving hunters and vanished into the darkness. The gathered vampires stood in silence, processing what they had witnessed. An impossible transformation, a display of power that shouldn't exist, and a declaration of war against the established order that had governed their kind for centuries. Nathan was the first to move. She approached me slowly, then knelt at my feet. I pledge myself to your cause, she said, her voice carrying across the stunned crowd. My strength, my wisdom, my centuries of experience, all in service of what you represent. Other vampires followed. One by one, then in groups, they knelt before us, before the bond we shared, before the hope we embodied. Ezequiel pulled me close, and through our connection, I felt his overwhelming love, his fierce pride, his ancient soul finally finding peace after 400 years of searching. We started something tonight, he murmured against my hair. Something that cannot be undone. I know. I looked out at the kneeling vampires, at the stars wheeling overhead, at the world that had become so much larger and stranger than I ever imagined. Is this what you wanted, when you walked into my coffee shop 3 months ago? I wanted coffee, he admitted, and I felt his smile through our bond. But I found something infinitely better. What? He turned my face toward his ancient eyes soft with emotion that had survived centuries of suppression. I found you, Leanne. I found home. I kissed him then in front of the gathered vampires, in front of the rebels who had pledged themselves to our cause, in front of the stars that had watched his kind since before human memory began. And when we finally broke apart, I felt something settling into place, a sense of purpose, of destiny, of a story that was only just beginning. So what happens now? I asked. Ezequiel's smile was ancient and new all at once. Now we build a sanctuary, gather allies. Prepare for the war that Carlil will inevitably bring. He squeezed my hand, and somewhere in between saving our kind from themselves, we figure out what forever actually looks like. That sounds complicated. It will be. His eyes gleamed with anticipation, but we'll face it together. That's what the bond means, Leanne. Never alone, never again. I looked at the vampires rising from their knees, at Nathan already organizing defenses, at Seamus quietly coordinating with the rebels he had led to us. 3 months ago, I had been a barista with a small life and smaller dreams. Now I was a vampire, a revolutionary, a beacon of hope for creatures who had forgotten what hope felt like. And standing beside me, his hand in mine, his heart connected to my heart through a bond that would last until the stars themselves burned out, was the vampire who had started everything by refusing to let me go. Vampires can't love, they had said. They were wrong, and we were going to prove it to them all. The moon hung full and bright over our mountain sanctuary as Ezequiel and I stood at the cave entrance, watching our new followers settle into their temporary home. Carlil will come, I said quietly, just like Julio warned. Yes. He'll bring everything he has. Yes. I turned to face my mate, my bonded, my forever. Are we ready? Ezequiel's smile was soft and fierce and full of the love that had shattered every law his kind held sacred. We survived rejection. We survived betrayal. We survived a transformation that should have killed you. He pressed his forehead against mine. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Together, I agreed. And as the first rays of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, forcing us to retreat into the shadows that were now my home, I felt something I had never felt in my quiet human life. Certainty. The Coven wanted us destroyed. Carlil Borman would send armies against us. The entire vampire world would have to choose sides in a war that had been brewing for 300 years. But none of that mattered, because I had Ezekiel. He had me. And the bond between us was stronger than any law, any army, any ancient power that tried to tear us apart. Vampires can't love. That's what they taught every newborn, every fledgling, every vampire who had ever dared to hope for something more than endless, lonely existence. But standing in my mate's arms, feeling his presence wrapped around my soul like armor, I knew the truth that Carlyle and his council had spent centuries trying to suppress. Vampires can love, and when they do, nothing in this world or the next can stand against them. This was only the beginning. If Leanne and Ezekiel's love has ignited something in you, if you believe that bonds forged in blood and fire deserve to survive what's coming, then subscribe now. Their revolution has just begun, and I promise you, the Coven's response will shake the vampire world to its foundations. Hit like if this story made your heart race. Comment below. Would you accept immortality for love? I'm reading every answer. Until next time, remember, true love doesn't just break rules. It rewrites them entirely.